they already can't function on a high capacity. You said, where are you getting that, preacher? Have you ever talked to him? There was a great big explosion that brought forth life. When has a bomb ever brought forth life? A bomb is a destructive force. The second question I would have is this. Where did that big mass come from that blew up and made the universe? Okay, where did it come from? And they're like, it always was. It always was a mass floating in space waiting to blow up and all the planets be round and follow around a burning star called the sun. How many of y'all follow it? They have no hope, people. It's easier to believe that there is a God that stood on nothing and spoke everything into existence than to believe there was a glob in the space that never knew what it was nor who put it there. It's the reason why God definitely spoke the word through Paul. Notice in verse 16, for by him were all things created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible. It don't matter whether it's a spirit or power, an atom, didn't matter. An angel, fallen angel, doesn't matter. The soul of man, doesn't matter. Whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created by him and for him. Why are you in this world? For God to use you. God has a purpose. God has a plan. All you got to do is get where God is and he'll show you what he wants you to do. Notice in verse 17, and he's before all things, and by him all things consist. He stood out on nothing, spoke everything into existence, brought it into existence that you and I one day could be born in a place and serve him. But of all the things he spoke into existence, there's only one he reached down and molded out of the clay of the earth, and that's man. You know, I'm not picking on anybody in the building. You know, I know you love your pets. And I'm not picking on anybody. I got two that are absolutely spoiled. Not only that, they smell bad. Okay? But can I tell you something? They're just an animal. When they die, they're just an animal. But that little baby, that young person, that middle-aged person, that elderly person, that is a human being that's going to spend eternity in either heaven or hell. The reality is, it doesn't matter how much we love said animal. It's just an animal. The only thing God reached down and picked up the clay and molded into a human being in the image of God, 3 parts, soul, spirit, and body, is man. He breathed into man, and man became a living soul. And from that point forward, man has one chief objective, if we could just learn it. And he's before all things, and by him all things consist. People, he is everything, and we need to be everything to him. To do his will and his pleasure as we breathe and live in the world we're surrounded by. So don't let them come by and tell you how bad things are. People, I know they're bad. I never picked up my Bible and said it's going to be so good one of these days, God's going to come back and set up his kingdom because everybody's doing right. If you find that in that Bible, please bring it to me. I want to read it. Because everything that I read says it's going to get worse and worse day by day. Man will become more corrupt as a society. And we're seeing it in our day and time. I'll give you a couple of thoughts on the great I Am. The first thing that I want you to see is the declaration of the great I am. Go to Isaiah chapter 44. Now you got to remember, Isaiah is writing about 100 years before Jeremiah comes on the scene. Thereabout, roughly. And he's writing to a kingdom that has sold themselves into sin and idolatry. And in the days of Isaiah, there's a great revival that brought Israel back to God, or Judah back to God. The northern kingdom was corrupt as it could be. They were idol worshippers from the very day that Jeroboam went up there. But Isaiah got to see revival in the days of Judah. And notice in verse number 6, thus saith the Lord, the King of Israel, and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts. I am the first and I am the last. Beside me there is no God. The declaration, he is declaring himself being who he is. People today struggle with the fact that there's only one God. If you get into the Buddhists and all of those, they tell us, Ms. Dan Akers told us in Japan, they have approximately 1,000 gods to pray to. People, I'm not trying to be ugly, but I know me. If I had 2 gods to pray to, I'd be praying at the wrong one at the wrong time. I'm not trying to be ugly, people. It's just me. I would be praying to the wrong God. I thank God I've got one. I know people that get into all the Hebrew names, Jehovah Nissi and all these, and they say, oh, I pray to this God. I don't. I just pray to God. I think it was B.R. Lakin that used to say, when I pray, I just set myself down at the Father's table and say, Father, your Son is here. Could you please pass the biscuits? People, when you're in trouble, it don't matter if you know the Hebrew name of God or not. You can call him Jehovah, you can call him Yahweh, you can go with all of that you want to, Jehovah Nissi, we can go through all of them. But you know what? In the moment of crisis, you're going to cry out to God in 3 letters. Why? Because you're in trouble. I've never seen anybody trying to figure out which character of God they were praying to when they were in trouble. They just cried out for mercy, cried out for help, cried out for God to intervene and work in their life. Now notice something. Not only is he one God, but one King of Israel, one Redeemer, the Lord of hosts. People, we live in a world today that people think they're in control. I mean, Bloomberg runs for president on his own money and threw away approximately some, $150, $200 million. He could have thrown me 50 cents. I'd have been happy. Why would you spend that much? Because he's got that much money to spend. We got people in the world now that's worth billions. Some as much as $20 to $30 billion. They think they're in control because how big their checkbook is. But one of these days when they stand before God, they'll find out God's in control and they're not. They may end up being surprised when they stand before God what all God expected they didn't deliver on. He's the Lord. Go to Revelation chapter 19. Verse number 16. The marriage supper of the Lamb is taking place. The bride is coming back with the Savior to take the world over by force. He's going to come from one valley and go to the valley that we all know, Armageddon. And he's going to speak in that valley, and the blood is going to run horse bridle deep in that valley. It's going to be bad for them. And by the way, those of you that have never ridden a horse, saved by the grace of God, you'll ride a horse one day. And not just any horse, one of God's horses. Notice in verse 16, and he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Who's in control? God. Yeah. Well, you don't understand, preacher. People make bad decisions. Yep. I'm not ruling that out. But they don't make a bad decision that God doesn't already know they're going to make. He does. He knew that. He doesn't will that per se, but God knows. God's God that changes not. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He knows the past and the future, all as if he's looking at one picture. I don't know about you, but I have problems trying to figure out what picture I'm looking at. Y'all may be a little bit better at that than me, and possibly so. But sometimes I look and it's like, what in the world is that a picture of? They call it art, and I can't figure out what it is. But God can look at a picture. The human race from beginning to end, 6,000 years of humanity, and see it as one broad picture. So to God, our life is in this broad picture. And God looks this way. He sees and knows everything we do. Man has a will. Man can get saved. Man can refuse it. Man can serve God. Man cannot serve God. That's their decision. But it's not going to surprise God. You know, it's sort of like Brother Burke was talking to a guy one day. And he got saved. And he was a big evolutionist and atheist and all of this. And he had a 5-year-old son. And he kept working with that son. And finally got that son convinced that there was no God. And you know what he asked Daddy when Dad got ready to leave the room? He said, Dad, why does God think about us not believing in him anymore? Guess who got saved the next week? Dad. He said, when you cannot drive the belief in God of a 5-year-old, there has to be a God. Not only that, he's King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Every ruler that has ever been in power will stand before God one day. Every knee's going to bow, every tongue's going to confess, people. That's across the globe and throughout humanity. But these leaders are going to come before God one at a time. Just like every lost person will come, and every saved person. We have our judgment, they have theirs. It's going to be I'm telling you, it's going to be an eye-opening experience. Because most people in this world is not ready for it. But it's still coming. Mark it down. It is still coming because God is still God. Go back to Isaiah 44. There's another phrase that he uses. Besides me, there is no God. God is telling Judah that you can go worship all these gods you want to. You can hang them up. You can serve them. You can burn incense to them. You can do whatever you want to. But you know what you're going to find out? There isn't but one God. That's me. You can do anything you want to.